Good evening. My name is Avinom Pad. I'm the director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut. And it's a real pleasure for me to welcome you here this evening for a very special lecture with Professor Adriana Brodsky on Jewish youth in Argentina. I want to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors from the University of Connecticut History Department and the Maurice Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Hartford. Thank you for your assistance in promoting this evening's program. In a moment, I will turn the screen over to my colleague, Professor Mark Healy, who is the chair of the History Department at UConn. But I'll just make a couple of technical notes, technical announcements before we start the program. So Professor Healy will offer some words of introduction and introduce our speaker this evening. You will note that all participants have been muted upon entry into the program. We will encourage you, though, to use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions of our speaker as she is speaking, and we'll be able to have a moderated Q&A and discussion after the lecture. And if you'd like to ask a question that you feel would be easier to express in verbally rather than typing through the chat function, just use the hand raise function, and after the lecture, we'll be able to unmute you and you can ask your question. So it's my pleasure to turn the screen over to my colleague, Dr. Mark Healy.
Thank you, Dr. Pat. Welcome to you all, also on behalf of the History Department. This is a great event. It is my delight and pleasure to introduce Dr. Adriana Brodsky, who is professor and chair of history at St. Mary's College in Maryland. We were just reminiscing a little bit about how long we have known each other, and I won't go into exact dates because we've now reached that time in our careers and that no longer is really appropriate. But let's just put it at the 1990s. So Adriana is a scholar of Argentina, of Judaism, of Latin America, of youth and identity, who has been someone that I have known and admired and learned immensely from for many years. She received her undergraduate training as originally an English teacher at Lenguas Vivas, a college in public college in Argentina, and was drawn into history, and then later received her master's and her PhD from Duke before going on to St. Mary's, where she has taught since. She is a path-breaking scholar, a leading figure among a new, perhaps no longer so new, but pioneering generation of scholars of Latin American Judaism, historians, literary scholars, anthropologists. And she has been a key figure in that constellation, an activist within scholarship, a joyful agitator, a thoughtful accompanist, a key voice in shaping, thinking about the Jewish experience in modern Latin America and thinking about and integrating Jewish identities and trajectories within thinking about modern Latin America more broadly. She's the author of a major book, Sephardi Jewish Argentine, Community and National Identity, 1880 to 1960, and also co-author of The New Jewish Argentina, with Renan Ryan, Facets of Jewish Experiences in the Southern Cone, as well as dozens of other articles and reflections, which range from discussions of community identity to thoughts about narratives and larger social processes. And the talk that she'll be giving today, as you'll see, touches on some of these things and takes them in directions that are both familiar and new. Adriana also has the unique distinction of sharing a name with another famous Argentine. And many of those of us with more or less common names have our other alter egos out there in the world. It so happens that hers was a particularly striking, perhaps distinguished, famously blonde Argentine actress of the 1970s and 80s. Yeah, actress. And without going into the qualities of that other Adriana Brodsky, that has meant since relatively early in life, she has had a number of kind of fun missed encounters or mistaken identity experiences in Argentine official contexts, perhaps no longer so much in the US, that she's been living these last decades. But I'd like to think that there also is some remote connection there with what has been one of the most consistent strands of her work all these years, which is thinking critically, thoughtfully, but also sometimes playfully about the ways that gendered and racialized, that Jewish identity has been gendered and racialized in Latin American life, and especially in Argentine life. The kind of moments, to take a phrase, when and where Jewish women, especially Sephardic Jewish women, have entered the Argentine scene. And so in some ways, these kind of connections and family identities and mistaken identities can lead us to reflect thoughtfully on larger experiences of identities, as I'm sure Professor Brodsky will do for us now. So please join me in welcoming Adriana Brodsky.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mark, for that wonderful presentation, introduction. And I just also wanted to thank the University of Connecticut History Department, and as well as the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life for this invitation and for this wonderful opportunity to present my work. Thank you. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. My book project from which this presentation draws charts the roles that youth were asked to play in shaping the Jewish Argentine community as Argentines in Argentina, in contributing to the creation and maintenance of the Jewish state. And it also reconstructs the actions that youth took to respond to those calls. During the period under study, which is the 1940s until 1976, Jewish Argentines paused several times to think about Jewish youth, the problems they faced, the roles they needed to play in the future of their community in Argentina, the roles that they needed to play for the future of Zionism, and the solutions that were needed to reach those objectives. It becomes clear after analysis that all these public discussions were driven by anxieties about losing the youth to Argentina. And with that loss, the ability of Jewish Argentines to continue communal life in the diaspora. So youth stood at the center of the anxieties as well as of the solutions to Jewish life in Argentina. The first section of my book seeks to reconstruct these ideas and these anxieties as they presented themselves regarding Jewish youth's problems and the plausible solutions imagined to would address them. For this, I use, among other sources, surveys that appeared in the early 1940s, a few in the 1960s, and a special section in a newspaper, in a Jewish newspaper that lasted for about 2 years in the early 1970s. The survey in 1941, which appeared in the weekly Mundo Israelita, entitled "The Problems and the Issues That Argentine Youth Are Facing," began with a call to wake the youth up from the apathy towards Jewish issues. In the context of the Holocaust in Europe, this call was actually a matter of life and death. Jews were dying in Europe, and it was imperative that Jewish youth understood the need to keep other Jewish communities alive. To many observers, America, and they used this term, they understood America as providing access to riches and materialism that was drawing Jewish people away from community concerns. So youth had to be brought back to the fold because of all these lures that America was providing. Zionism, the focus on the fight for the creation of the state, became the proposed solution. A new young state, right, and the connections here with youth of the country, the youth of Israel and the youth of the young, right, was actually made over and over. This rebirth that the new state would represent would help bring back pride also in Jewish identity, something that people and the young themselves described as needed. In the 1960s, and here I'm using one of the few elements or surveys that I found in newspapers, this one from the newspaper of Nuevación, which was the publication of Mapam, Hashomer Atzair in Buenos Aires. Again, Jewish apathy was identified as present after the euphoria that was produced by the creation of the state in the late 1940s. Now, the youth apathy discovered in the 1960s was found to be now the result of a Zionism that had failed to adapt to the change in times. Zionism of the 60s had not yet adapted to the youth of the 60s. And it was not necessarily because of the lure of outside then that there was a fear that youth would be lost. Rather, right, there was an internal failure of Zionism itself. And youth, again, right, were leaving Jewish communities, or at least not becoming involved in these Jewish communities because, right, how obsolete Zionism had become. And in 1971, this is again the same weekly that I discussed in connection with the 1941 survey. This was a section that was called in Spanish Aquí la Juventud, or Spotlight on Youth, which interviewed and brought young people. They asked questions. It kind of varied through the 2 years that this section lasted. But what one can see is that the Jewish youth were indeed mobilized by 1971, but around matters that connected them to other young people in the Americas. The New Left had managed to attract young Jews to fight for problems that had to do more with just Jewish issues. So in order to keep young Jews within the fold of Judaism, what they needed to be shown was that there was a Jewish path to revolution, which was a word that was buzzing around in the 1960s and 70s, and that it was in Israel, right, through life on a commune, on the kibbutz, that revolution, that realization as Jews would come about. Now, the second part of my book focuses on how Jewish youth responded to these anxieties and to the calls that were made to them to act. But youth were not merely reactive. In fact, in many cases, they ended up carrying their own plans, far from what adults and institutional leaders had in mind for them. My work focuses on Sephardi youth in particular. These anxieties about youth are about all Jewish youth in Argentina, but I focus on what Sephardi youth did in particular. So the examples that I will be presenting to you today will be drawn from the Sephardi communities. Now, I want to say that among Sephardim, Zionism played a central role in constructing a Sephardi identity in Argentina. Whereas the various Sephardim initially tended to create social, religious, cultural, and philanthropic institutions around their city or cities of origin or regions of origin, and therefore they settled in different parts of the city of Buenos Aires, in different areas in the country, they did come together, right, around Zionist institutions and around Zionist fundraising. So thus, among Sephardim, amongst Sephardi Zionism, right, the role of youth was central, not only to awaken youth and to lure them away from non-Jewish activism, but also to help construct a unified Sephardi identity in Argentina vis-a-vis the Ashkenazim. Zionism then helped Sephardi Argentines and their youth feel grounded in Jewish life in Argentina. Today, I will present two cases of Sephardi youth Zionist activity. In the 1940s, pre and post the creation of the State of Israel, and in the 1960s, case on which I will spend a little bit more time. Now, I want to say that these are just two, right? I mean, there's so many things that I could have brought, but I think that these two examples will help me pull some to address some conclusions at the end. So Israel was, as I mentioned, in the context of the Holocaust in Argentina, imagined as a refuge, a place of refuge for those who had survived the horrors of in Europe. Jews in Argentina, safe, even if not completely exempt from anti-Semitism, understood from day one that Israel was certainly not the only place where Jews could be safe. In fact, they kept talking over and over about the fact that Argentina was a welcoming space for them, that Jews in general felt welcomed by the Argentine society and the government. And so Israel, in a sense, was not a necessity for them, for the Argentine Jews. It was a place of refuge for those in Europe, right, that had lost their homes and that found no homes of their own. Jews in Argentina also from the very beginning understood, right, the potential conflict that the very existence of a Jewish state would present for young Jews in Argentina if they wished to become involved in Zionism. And so I'm going to quote from Julieta Kamhi, who was a young Sephardi woman whose parents had arrived in the early 1920s from Jerusalem and who settled in this country. She noted, some young Argentine Jews believe that they cannot be good Jews while being good Argentines. For her, good Jews were those who, despite their love for their new home, Argentina, they did not renounce their Jewish condition, traditions, history, customs, and the language of their people. To some, she understood Jewish education and the open love for another country appeared as a challenge to their sense of being Argentines. Yet Zionism, the belief in the need of a Jewish state for Julieta Kamhi, represented an important tool to bring back pride in being Jewish, which would allow young Jewish Argentines to be less apathetic and willing to become involved in the fight for the new state. So through education, as you can see from the quote here, young men and women will realize that we were not always a persecuted people. This idea of the Holocaust, right, that was something that she understood, right, could make people feel embarrassed of their Jewish identity. We were not always a persecuted people if we learn about the history. We had a home, right, in which we developed our own culture and a social legislation that became a model for others. So in this way, education was not simply imagined as a way to achieve a more prepared youth, and here perhaps seeking to correct, right, the overall stereotype of the uncultured Turco or Ottoman member, but a youth that through knowledge of its history could become proud Jews in Argentina. Julieta Kamhi and a few of her female friends, most of them related to families that came from Jerusalem, were tapped to fundraise for the Sephardi Zionist Center as part of the group that worked on behalf of the Keren Kayemet, the Jewish National Fund. So they were imagined as, as being able to have time, they would be persuaded, they would be persuasive to get funds going. And so this was a way in which adults and the leadership of the Keren Kayemet Sephardi branch thought they could use, the energy of the young. However, right, what these young women did was create a Comisión de Señoritas, Young Women's Commission, that embarked on a much more ambitious plan to educate Sephardi youth. Here is one of the many events that they organized, and they were extremely, extremely busy organizing events, in particular, starting in the 1940s, all throughout, the creation of the state. So here is, for those of you who do not read, Spanish, a talk about the Jewish problem, in which she herself, Julieta Kamki, was going to talk. But there's also a projection of slides about Eretz Israel, which would have involved a description of what Israel looked like and discussions, right, of this land that is not yet, right, the state, but it is there. After the creation of the State of Israel, Julieta Kamki began editing the magazine Anwar Sephardi, which means Sephardi, the Sephardi youth, which continued, right, with its self-imposed plan to educate young Sephardim on Zionism. Again, right, even though this was not the exclusive task of this Young Women's Commission, many of the collaborators were members of that group. Reminiscing in 1992 from Israel, to where she eventually made Aliyah, she wrote of this group of young women, and I quote here, "I am moved by those young adolescents who wrote history at a time when what most young women from well-to-do Sephardi families wanted to do was to attend balls." And I want to keep thinking about women. She's such a wonderful example of the way in which Sephardi women were drawn into just to do the fundraising, and yet they developed their own massive education plan without any training, right? So in some of the minutes that I have of their work, they just talk about the fact that they did not know where to get information. They had to learn how to research. They had to learn how to stand in front of an audience and present the topics that they wished to study. And they were extremely active. Now, Julieta, as I said, did not make Aliyah as a member of a pioneering youth movement. But the Sephardim of the 1940s did create one movement of their own. Moved by the realization that Sephardim did not have a youth movement for Sephardim, a few young men who attended a social club in Argentina, Maccabi, which was a Jewish social sports club, and who had joined in the activities of Anwar Atzioni, which was one of these youth Zionist movements, they decided to mimic what they were learning in the club Maccabi and teach it to other young Sephardim. They initially started meeting at somebody's homes. I talked to this young man at the time. Well, I talked now. He was very young at the time, and he remembers we met in our homes, and then we started moving to other people's homes, and I would teach people Rikudim and Zionist songs. Now, they recall very clearly that one of the reasons why they decided to separate and not go to Maccabi was because a lot of the discussions amongst the members of Anwar Atzioni were in Yiddish, and Sephardim did not speak that language. Eventually, they expanded from a few of from this kernel, which was the consequence of members, people that knew each other from their parents, and also from attending the same schools. And eventually, this pioneering youth movement brought together young men and women from various Sephardi communities, and mostly on their own created the program, the youth movement called Echalutz. So many of the members of Echalutz ended up making Aliyah and founding actually Kibbutz Oraner, which is in the south, very close to Gaza, in the early 1950s. By then, they actually had merged with Gordonia Maccabi Hatzair and later with Dror. And when that happened, when they were absorbed by these larger youth movements, the Sephardi specificity was lost. But from 1948 until around 1956, this was the only Sephardi pioneering movement that they could, that young people could belong to. And they worked, right, in various, various communities all over the city of Buenos Aires and even outside of the city of Buenos Aires, attempting to start inculcating, right, some of the pioneering, ideals. And so what we see here is one of the summer camps, just a very short weekend organized by Echalutz in the 1940s. So this was after the creation of the state, in which right now the idea of perhaps, right, moving to Israel and living, right, in a kibbutz was beginning to sound appealing. And I want to, in particular, I liked this photograph for many reasons. But we see a lot of young women and with an older looking woman. And I don't know if you see my mouse over here, but this was the grandmother of several of the women who participated in the summer camp. This was the Madrich, Shabbatai Bachbut, members of Aleppo, Damascens, and even Moroccan. This lady was Moroccan as well. So one of the interesting things is that, parents from these Sephardi communities would not let young women spend the night out of their homes. And so the only reason why they were allowed to attend this summer camp was because the grandmother went as a chaperone. And so again, right, we see women, right, through access to and participation in these Zionist activities, breaking many of the boundaries and many of the traditions that existed at the time. I wanted to also say very briefly that Echalutz, which, as I mentioned, started in the around 1945, merged in the early 1950s with a similar Sephardi group from Uruguay. And this is something that we will also see with the next case that I will start talking about right now, sort of bringing together not just then Sephardim from different origin in Argentina, but also then combining or bringing together Sephardim in other parts of Latin America. So the second case that I want to present to you is the story of Krizakna, another Sephardi Zionist youth movement, which also initiated on their own. And by on their own, I mean there's no shadiach, there's no emissary. These are just young people making decisions to start something that they see does not exist. This is also another Sephardi Zionist youth movement that also took on the task of bringing Zionism and the idea of Aliyah to a kibbutz to the youth of various Sephardi institutions of different origins. Now, the key issue that youth raised during the late 1950s and early 1960s was the need to modernize Jewish practices and rituals, as well as the actual meaning of Zionism itself. The adults, in their view, and many adults also, took it upon themselves to criticize themselves for having failed, to adapt for the times. And because of this failure, right, again, youth was apathetic, youth was likely to leave their Jewish identity aside and remove themselves, right, from community life. In conjunction with the debate in Argentina over religious versus lay education, right, which will explode in the Laica o Libre struggles in 1958 and 1959, Jewish educational institutions came to be seen not simply as purveyors of Jewish history and Jewish traditions or even Zionism, but also part and parcel of Argentine society that could be entrusted with the education of its citizens. Young men and women were demanding that schools viewed them as both Argentines and Jews. The new Jewish schools that came into existence during this period as a consequence of this discussion about Jewish education attempted to bridge the gap. Full-day schools, not just after-school Jewish programs, which would shape Argentine citizens and which addressed a much wider vision, broader vision of Jewish identity, which was not purely religious. And this, right, for the Sephardim, very traditionalists, right, was a challenge, a very hard challenge to address. These schools, these Jewish schools in general in Argentina, which were called integral schools, integrales, suggested, right, which was the project at hand, to integrate, right, both the ethnic, the Jewish part, and the national. Students learned the state curricula in these schools. The overall response to these educational opportunities was positive, right? According to the Efraim Sadov, who studied Jewish education in Argentina, the percentage of Jews from 5 to 12 years of age that attended Jewish schools increased from 46% to 58% during the first 5 years of the 1960s. Now, among the Sephardim, right, we will see in this next case that the move to modernize Jewish education required confronting an adult leadership that was very, very reticent to making these changes. This youth group includes the words chinuchit, right? So education. They are, yes, they're a Zionist, youth group, but their intention is focused on educating, right? Which again represents the climate and the issues at stake. Now, the founders of this group, Krizakna, actually were members of youth groups from two distinct Sephardi communities that were located in different sections of the city. The community of those who had originally come from Rhodes that were located in the neighborhood of Colegiales, and the religious synagogue was called Shalom, but there were a lot of satellite organizations in which were social, cultural, that were all related to Shalom, and a community in the neighborhoods of Boca that were originally by people that arrived from Damascus and who settled, as I mentioned, in the city, in the neighborhood of La Boca here. And so the founders of Krizaknas are going to come from these two very different communities. The older adult members would never have really crossed paths, but the youth are going to come together to found Krizakna in 1962. But until then, and they had already started their activism in their communities of origin. And so between early 1956 and mid 1959, young Sephardim from this neighborhood in La Boca, whose parents belonged to the congregation Or Torah, originally from members of from Damascus, organized a Jewish youth center And throughout this period, between 1956 and 1959, periodically clashed with the lay and religious leadership of the institution. The thorny issues were the need for ritual practices that were more accessible for the young, Jewish education that was not exclusively religious, and the degree of independence that youth would have within the community given their objectives for action and activities. While youth, whose voices we only hear indirectly in the minute books of Or Torah, complained about the lack of understanding from adults, the minute books make it clear that the institution attempted to address and solve, right, some of the questions that these youth were bringing. But it is also evident that the proposals presented by the youth to carry out their ideals about what Jewish education was clashed with the community's project for their school, which was in the hands of religious authorities that tended to be only focused on training young men, right, for services and rituals, preparing them for the various rituals for men. Ultimately, through these challenges and with varying degrees of success, youth proposed new ideas about what type of Jewish education was necessary to address the realities in late 1950s Argentina and what youth expected from religious practices and rituals, topics that they will continue to pursue in the next decades. Education really never stops being the issue starting in the 50s. These changes were central in their words for the survival of the community. Again, youth would leave if they could not be made to feel relevant and if they could not learn about Jewish culture and life, not just about religious practices and rituals, which is, right, in communities from Damascus and Aleppo, was actually most of the activities that took place. Although this youth group and Or Torah clashed various times over the teaching of Hebrew and the refusal to be granted space to meet in, the complete breakdown came sometime in early 1958. The minute books of the congregation actually make no reference to the physical confrontation that took place. But participants, the young participants, actually recall vividly this event, if not exact details. So after the continuous refusal to grant the youth group access to space and to continue to offer very small accommodations in the synagogue, most likely so that they could keep an eye on what they were doing and on what they were saying, the youth decided at a general meeting to take by force a house that the congregation owned on Asada Street, and which was not being used for, they said, anything in particular. In fact, they told me that, this is where the old guys went to play poker, to play cards. They broke the front door lock one night, or obtained the keys. Particulars are a little fuzzy. A few of them spent the night there. A young woman was one of them, 1956. Intent on not leaving the premises until given permission to use that building for their activities. The group had also created flyers that were distributed and posted all throughout the neighborhood in cafes, shops owned by congregants, distributed to people that they saw in the streets. By the morning, of course, word had spread widely that the property had been taken, and Or Torah called for an assembly to deal with the situation. Participants of the youth group recalled the victory as the facilities were granted and the youth could continue organizing the many events they wished to pursue. Conflict continued, however. At stake was whether the youth would be able to carry out their plans if they contravened religious precepts, or if they engaged in activities that would usually be under the control of the religious and lay authorities. For example, the youth wished to hold events on Friday evenings at this new property, at the property that they took over. And they say, well, it's only talks and you can have, educational chats. This does not contravene religious precepts. But Or Torah refused to give them permission on the grounds that they were breaking Shabbat laws. And they asked them to go and get rabbinical dispensation in order for them to carry their petition. Youth also requested permission again to offer 2 evenings of Hebrew courses, which they wanted to hire modern teachers to teach. The reason Torah gave for their rejection was that the rabbi of the institution is already teaching Hebrew. Of course, that was a religious Hebrew, and the youth wanted modern Hebrew. As well, and perhaps even more problematic for Torah, was that because they were not allowed to hold events on Friday evenings at this taken property, the youth had begun to gather in their own homes. So Torah appeared to initially think that it was important for youth to remain within the fold of the organized community, but most of the youth of the neighborhood had concrete ideas about what to do that did not necessarily involve the type of control and submission that Torah envisioned. In their recollections of the times, and I interviewed many of these members, they stressed that, and I quote here, the members of the community and their leadership wanted nothing to do with Zionism, but to follow religious traditions and practices. Imbued in the climate of the times, which rejected traditional models of instruction based on mindless repetition, which was the method used in the religious schools of Torah, these young defended their educational and cultural plans with the belief that it was essential that they put them into practice. What was at stake, they believed, was Jewish youth itself, and with them, a Jewish identity not just conceived of as religious practice. And they were right that these changes actually would bring youth back to the community. Once they were able to start using the building of Asara Street, they drew close to about 100 young people, to this institution. They organized events like Jewish book fairs, lectures, and of course, dances. Now, a few of these rebellious youth were selected to attend the workshop for leaders in Israel. And the person to thank for that was this emissary from Israel who came to Argentina in 1958 with the intention of promoting Zionism amongst Sephardim. And it is thanks to Yosef Meyuchas, who spoke perfect Ladino, so he could as well as Arabic, and so he could communicate both with the Ladino-speaking as well as with the Arabic speakers in Argentina. These young people were sent to Israel to start being trained in the year-long program that took place in Jerusalem at the Machon LeMadrichei Chutz La'aretz. Youth members of both this Barracas or this La Boca community and youth members of the group in the other congregation in Colegiales were sent, and it was at their return in 1962 that they decided to get together to create the Krizakna. So in May of 1962, the group Krizakna actually made its official debut with a Passover Seder. And I have here the publication, the way in which the event was announced in the newsletter of the Keren Kayemet. It was an event, now you have to imagine, Damascene community, very traditional in practice. This Passover Seder, which was, first of all, a third Seder, right? So the Zionist Seder, was performed and actually led by the youth themselves. And the leaders, right, were 18-year-olds. We're not talking about leaders, 20s or 30s. This was an event that was just done by the youth themselves. Those of you who can read will see that, in this festival, which actually became a very used strategy by youth over and over again, besides the actual reading of the Haggadah, youth dramatized decisive moments in the life of our people, like the escape from Egypt led by Moses, the oppression and the heroic rebellion in Warsaw, the wonderful reality of a state forging its future with their flag, and life in Israel now, then, by exemplified or expressed by Israeli songs and dance. And as you can see from the ad as well, right, the event took place right in one of the buildings of the Ortora, the congregation in Colegiales. Now, the relationship between the members of this group and the social, so the relationship between the members of Krizakna and the members, right, of the social club Shalom in Colegiales was not as cordial as the one between Krizakna and the Ortora. Members of Shalom, whose families attended the club and the temple, sought to carve a space for the education of the youth. They were able to force the steering committee of the club to create a youth department and place the Krizakna members at its helm. Groups of different aged children went on nature outings, visited museums, celebrated Jewish holidays, and organized events with other Jewish youth and Jewish institutions, all within the first month of their creation. But when the members presented their plan of action and openly stated their desire to instill pioneering ideals to settle in Israel, the steering committee and the parents got scared. The club withdrew the promised support and actually ejected the Krizakna members from the club. Youth activities just became sports in this club. They were allowed back in April 1963, but only for a short time. What did they do after they were kicked out? Well, they actually denounced the community. So this is not the physical takeover of a building, but this is actually just printing out a newsletter and distributing it to all the members, exhorting, right, that the membership of the club and their families listen to them. And I quote here from the first slide: "We will not continue passively waiting. We won't offer the other cheek. We will come out of this lethargy that seeks to sink us. We will wake up." And then in the next slide, the youth department should be opened again, not just for our benefit, but for the benefit of the whole community. And I'm sure Mark would appreciate this, but they finally quoted Sarmiento, president of Argentina in the 1800s, the par excellence, symbol of education in Argentina and a fighter against authoritarianism. This first line is a very well-known line by Sarmiento. They added a little bit, they just edited a little bit. It says, "Youth represent ideas, barbarians. Ideas cannot be killed. So don't kill us. We just have ideas that need to be addressed." So the youth did not give up, and they learned from their past actions. They avoided completely talking about pioneering ideals, the chaluts. They just, they learned, right, their lesson from before, but that actually did not work out well for the groups. They were eventually expelled again in 1966, never to be allowed to return. And so I'm actually gonna just keep going a little quicker, just to first of all remind you that the Krizakna did not dissolve because they were not able to work inside this Shalom community. Actually, most members followed the Krizakna and met now in the taken home on the street of Azara in the community in Colegiales. But as well, right, they had created centers in other Sephardi communities. There is another center in the city of Olivos, as well as another center in Flores among the Ottoman Turks who had settled in that neighborhood. Now they continued pushing for change, now without needing to be careful on whose toes they were stepping on. In their meetings of the older youth members, those who were preparing to make Aliyah, they began treating not just Jewish topics, but youth topics that the 1960 youth were interested in. So here we have some of the material that they produced for teaching the younger groups. We see here that they are discussing things like the países subdesarrollados, underdeveloped countries. Here, understanding national politics, the role of Perón and the left, among other topics that of course had to do with different interpretations of Jewish holidays and always, right, sort of using Zionist interpretations of those holidays. So let me just bring some conclusions so that we have time to talk and to answer some of the questions and to hopefully just start a nice discussion. Zionism was invoked as a means to avoid assimilation, not necessarily and exclusively, right? As a path to get Jews out of Argentina. In the 1940s, Zionism was imagined as a way to instill pride amongst Jews. Learning about Jewish history and culture and the history of Zionism allowed young Jews to feel connected to a past that was worthy of remembering and that could help them stand proud in Argentina. It also allowed young Jews to help their co-religionists build a state that would provide a home for those homeless. Some Sephardi youth found in the existing Zionist youth organizations no room for themselves as Sephardim, so they founded one of their own. They understood that without Sephardi Zionist institutions, Zionism would not reach Sephardim, most of whom had not really been exposed to Zionism prior to their arrival in Argentina. But in developing and organizing Zionist activities, youth also contributed to energize their communities and bring about important changes. Julieta Kamji and the young women who attended these overnight camps engaged in activities that moved away from simply fundraising for the Jewish funds. They created an agenda that included public speaking, reaching out to non-Sephardi Zionist women leaders, educating themselves and others, and seeking to unite Sephardi youth. Zionism can and should be credited with the birth of an Argentine Sephardi identity based on common goals. In the late 1950s and 1960s, Zionism and Jewish communities saw the need to be modernized. Youth saw themselves as the vanguard whose role it was to update Jewish life in order to again ensure a Jewish future in Argentina. Embedded in the context of the rise of youth as political actors, process described so well by Valeria Manzano, Jewish youth understood the role they had to play. They faced important hurdles in the very community leaders who led the organizations that were supposed to be sustaining Jewish life. They questioned the actual interests of these leaders. They called them Sionistas de Salón, just living room Zionists, right? Rather than people that are doing stuff, they're just claiming Zionism from their living room chairs in Argentina. And they, the youth saw them as just more worried about keeping the gamblers, the card playing members of their communities happy than in making room for youth action. Youth in charge of youth, breaking hierarchies, challenging norms, preparing for life on socialist kibbutzim, leaving behind their families who had plans for them based on what they would call bourgeois ideals, right, that they came to discard. And while not all the members of the Krizakna left for Israel, in fact, most did not, the members that made Aliyah is only just a very small fraction of all those that participated in these events, their path through to Krizakna left a deep mark on them. They became involved in Jewish institutions and ensured Jewish life in Argentina. Looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adriana. And I wish we could do a round of applause, but we'll do our virtual round of applause. So why don't we stop the share for now? That's perfect. And I would love to take any questions that that anyone in the audience may have. You can feel free to type them into the chat or use the hand raise function. And in the meantime, I'll start us off as we wait for questions to come in from the audience. I think my first question is just a question of sort of the broader context of the Jewish community in Argentina. Can you give us a sense for the demographics of sort of Ashkenazi versus Sephardic community, time of migration? You mentioned that the Sephardi community, you have Jews coming from the Middle East, from North Africa. What's the difference in terms of when these migrations take place of the Jews from Eastern Europe to Argentina? So just tell us a little bit more about sort of what the community looks like, let's say in this post-World War II period.
Sure, that's a great question. So Sephardim, I would say that it was about 12 to 15% of the whole Jewish community. So they were a clear minority within the large Jewish community in Argentina. Within, right, Sephardim, the largest percentage actually were the Arabic speakers. So Jews from Aleppo and from Damascus were the largest group. Then we have Jews that came from places like present-day Turkey. I mean, the geography at the time just changed so many times that, from Turkey and as well as from other areas in the Ottoman Empire at the time, and then from Morocco, and much smaller communities from Italy, as well as from other places. And so the Sephardim, we are looking right at a minority, but certainly compared to Sephardim in the United States, they were a much larger percentage. So Sephardim tended to come in waves. The first group to arrive were actually the Moroccans, who moved earlier on. The first Sephardi congregation in Argentina was actually Sephardim from Morocco. And then we have various waves in the 1920s. Imagine conflicts going over in the old world, and how that kind of generated waves, right, of immigrants coming to Argentina. The Ashkenazim, if you kind of know the waves that came to the United States, they mostly followed those. What we will see, however, is that after 1924, when the United States passes its limitations on the immigrants, there would be an increase coming to Argentina.
Thank you. I'm going to bring Mark on screen with us for the next question. Go ahead, Mark.
So I was just wondering, as you're suggesting that Zionism was this kind of path to unify the Sephardim in the earlier moment in the 40s, to what degree, and it seems to be continuing to play that role through Krizakna and these other instances in the 1960s, how much do they find spaces of alliance or possibility with Ashkenazi youth at this moment? I mean, how much of there is there kind of does there begin to be kind of some shared generational tensions within the Jewish community, within different sectors of the Jewish community, or does it continue to really play out quite differently? So just sort of sketch out a little bit the kind of broader possibilities of alliance and suggestion, and and how the members of the movement see that themselves.
So great question, thank you. So in 1964, the members of the Krizakna, in a meeting in Mar del Plata at somebody's home, decided to actually join Hashomer Hatzair. after having consulted with representatives from several other youth movements. So they remember meeting with La Merhab, they remember meeting with Anwar Atzioni, and they decided that they were going to join in, or become part of the family of Hashomer Atzair, which is mostly made up of Ashkenazi groups. Now, what continues to drive these Sephardi youth movements is the belief that if they do not continue working exclusively in the Sephardi communities, nobody is going to be able to bring Zionism to Sephardim. Yeah. That Sephardim would not be able, would not want to listen to any Ashkenazi talking about these things that are so, foreign to, that it is up to them, and they are not willing to give up that self-appointed, position. And therefore, yes, they meet, with the Hashomer Atzair representative. They participate in the youth structures that were created within the Argentine Jewish community. They participate in the youth directory. But their intention is not to just become taken up by them. They are not interested in that. They see themselves as central, the vanguard, of Zionism amongst Sephardim, and so they do want to keep that distance, They do not want to become part of Ashkenazi and Ashkenazim, and therefore lose this role that they see as playing, and that they see as essential for Jewish life, for Jewish Sephardi life in Argentina.
I find it really interesting as you're talking about sort of how Zionism performs this important function that's separate from either being a place of refuge for Jewish life after the war, or building a Jewish national home, but it's actually sort of this tool at creating and carving a separate and distinctive identity, both for Sephardim, but also young people, that can sort of project and rebel against the older generation, especially if they actually have no intent to actually make aliyah and move, which is really interesting too.
Right. Many would say that, that they wanted to, and that they were, practicing and preparing for, but that eventually then my mom got sick and I had to stay for 1 year, and then life happened, and then they stayed, I think that they all were participating with, the hope that they would be able to do that.
I have a couple of questions that have come in from the audience. So Joanna Sliva, hi Joanna, asks the question, thank you for an interesting presentation. Did the Argentine Jewish youth have opportunities to meet with Jewish youth from elsewhere in South America? Did they have joint youth camps, for example? So that's a great question. Tell us a little bit about what were the summer camps like, and where did they meet? Yeah.
So always the issue of the summer camps, and I have wonderful stories about the leaders. And the leaders were 17-year-old people, There were no adults. And actually some of the members say, I would never have allowed my child to go with me as a leader, because what did I know when I was 17? They had, they would have a doctor that would be on hand, but it was really run by very young and inexperienced, members. In the 1940s, one of the ladies that was actually not in the photograph that you saw of the 1949 summer camp, but who later married the madrich who is in the picture. She remembers at a summer camp a kid just climbing up on the water tower and just threatening to kill himself, and the sort of the sheer fear, of not being able to to solve the situation and to prevent this kid from jumping off the water tower. So there was a lot of uncertainty, and therefore it was hard for the parents to actually give permission to to these kids, and therefore that's why it was essential that those that were doing the ask of parents, were people that they knew, and so that's why when my mom would go to the neighbor's home and say, what do you mean you're not going to let your child go to the camp? It's my daughter who's leading it, right? So the familiarity of the faces, enabled a sort of trust, right? That was what was needed, right? Because these now in the 60s, things are going to be a little bit more complicated. There is in the 1962 with there's a lot of anti-Semitism. Right-wing groups are actually aiming to physically hurt Jews, and so a lot of the movements, youth movements, are going to travel together to a same area where they're going to be close to each other. They're going to create guards at night. And so this in the 1960s, there's several, right? And therefore it's a little bit easier to keep, to keep them safe. But therefore it's also easier to provide medical attention if needed. But I just want to, especially these Sephardi groups, these kids are on their own. They do a lot of the pioneering things. They learn how to put up tents. They learn all the pioneering chalutzi, elements that they need to know in preparation, right, for life on the kibbutz. They're not just having fun, but they're, in their minds training for, the rough life of these kibbutzim as it's coming up. So I hope that I kind of provided a little bit of an idea about what these events look like.
And did they get together with young people from other countries in South America also?
So yes, so both Echalutz and Krizakna are actually going to reach out and start working together with Sephardi youth in Uruguay. And eventually there is, for those groups that actually decide to make Aliyah, there was at the very beginning, until the late 1950s, a 1-year training, the Akshara, which was, cutting yourself off from your family, actually moving to the middle of nowhere and attempting to replicate the kind of life that you would live on a kibbutz. And so they joined the first group, Echalutz, the Krizakna. It becomes sort of the joining of the Buenos Aires, Argentina and Uruguay group becomes called Echalutz de Krizakna, and they do Akshara together. So they go to this 1-year preparation in the middle of nowhere together with Sephardim from Uruguay. And then there's a couple of people from Brazil and from Chile who join the Krizakna of the 60s as well. So yes, they are, in a sense, not just creating an Argentine Sephardi identity, but they're also kind of thinking in terms of, Latin American Sephardi identity as well.
Nice. Joan Sidney asked the question, what was the significance of the Henrietta Sold sign in the camp photo?
I think that every tent was supposed to, name their, their tent with somebody that was significant in the history of Zionism, and so that these were always opportunities, right, to learn about, Jewish history, about the history of Zionism, things that, again, right, were not being taught in any of the Jewish schools that they would have had access to, but rather, right, were being taught by the members of these youth organizations that took it upon themselves to bring that knowledge and that, those topics to these communities that otherwise they did not know.
Notable figures from the broader movement. Okay, I see another question has come in, and this comes from my mother, Nurit, who's joining us from Santa Fe, New Mexico, who asks, were the Sephardi youth against meeting with the Ashkenazi youth or the other way around? So tell us a little more about the dynamics between the youth movements. And I'm actually curious if I can add to that. I know that sort of there's a Buenos Aires in particular is a burgeoning site of Yiddish culture in the post-war period, and many members of the Jewish Labor Bund who sort of have no future in Eastern Europe and Poland in particular end up in Buenos Aires. So tell us a little bit more about these interactions between the Ashkenazi Sephardi Jewish youth and this, carving out a distinctive space separate from the Ashkenazi youth.
Yeah, so I don't think there was a plan to not get together with Ashkenazim. I'm thinking in terms of the Sephardi youth. It's not that they said, we'll never hang out with Ashkenazim. But I think that, as I mentioned before, right, because they saw how central their role was in, working within the Sephardi communities, because without their work, right, there would be no chance of Sephardim accessing, right, all this knowledge that was not just being freely taught. That their activism, their Zionist activism, by necessity, according to them, needed to happen in Sephardi institutions. And so, they went to schools, they lived in Jewish neighborhoods, so they went to school and they met, Ashkenazi youth. But when it came to their Zionist activism, right, that was something that they thought, right, needed to be focused on the Sephardi communities. And so this group, right, these two groups, right, the Chalutz, the Krizakna in the 40s, the Krizakna in the 50s and 60s, and eventually Baderech that will come, 68 onward. That's what they want to do. They just want to work inside Sephardi institutions, and therefore they are not going to be active, and participating with other. But again, it's not like they don't know Ashkenazim, right? But right, their activism, is imagined as needing to happen inside Sephardi institutions.
Good, very, very interesting. Well, Adriana, I want to thank you so much for a really fascinating presentation and really insightful analysis of probably a part of both Argentine Jewish history and broader scope of modern Jewish history that many of us have not received. So thank you for bringing us this topic. And I want to thank our co-sponsors from the History Department at the University of Connecticut, and Mark Healy, and I see Amy Weiss writing in from the Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Hartford. So really want to thank both of you for co-sponsoring and promoting tonight's program. And thank you everyone for being here. And thank you again, Adriana, really, really fascinating. Great to see you.
Thank you. Thanks.